So today's Kill Your Lawn. I wrote this lecture a number of years ago, back when me and Mark Richardson were working together at Native Plant Trust. It was New England Wildflower Society then, and we had been discussing with the administrators how we should tackle this idea of lawns and how the organization wanted to tackle the idea of lawns. And they told us to be delicate and be polite and be calm about it. And we decided to go with the campaign Kill Your Lawn, which wasn't exactly all that delicate, but definitely got the message across. So this lecture has kind of evolved over the past couple of years. I've had so many questions about various lawn alternatives and different kind of pieces that I really expanded this to get past. We're going to spend most of our time talking about native plants, but I'm also going to talk about really everything having to do with lawn that I think is applicable today. So with a touch of luck, I'll have time at the end of this for questions. Timing has always been my weakest point, so we'll see how this goes. So with that in mind, let's delve into it. Let me just fix my screen real quick. There we go. All right, so the question is, what are we doing here today? And better question is, what in God's name is that guy doing in this picture? We're going to kind of go through this in a sequential order. I want to talk to start with why I think lawns are a bad idea. The problems associated with lawns. And in my case, what I mean by that is mostly ecological issues. With the 4-hour version of this lecture, which we are not doing today, we can expand into a variety of better options, and we'll get some of the real stars today. We're going to go into what I'm calling gradients of ecology. And what I mean by that is, how bad is the lawn and what is our best option? And what are all these pieces in between? I'll talk today about replacing lawns with native species. I really try and strive to be as realistic as possible. So I'm going to talk about, for example, one native species that'll take you 3 to 5 years to get established as a lawn. That doesn't necessarily work for everyone. So I want to give you various different options and talk about why each one might be better than the traditional lawn and why a native species or some sort of alternative might be a better option. We'll start with the idea of treating your traditional lawn right. This is not your best option, but for many people, it's a good starting point. It's definitely a step in the right direction. We'll get into non-native alternatives like eco lawns and clover and things like that, kind of moving up in this gradient of ecology. We will spend most of our time talking about native alternatives. And then we're going to talk about this idea of replacing lawns with things that are not lawns and where and how that might actually work in a way that doesn't disrupt the needs of, say, a particular sort of lawn space. So let's start at the top. What is the problem with lawns? Lawns in America cover about 50 million acres of soil. That's roughly the size of Nebraska. It's actually a little bit bigger than Nebraska. There's a massive amount of space we've got for a non-native species that doesn't really give us anything in terms of food or ecology, or a variety of other things we might ask for a plant. We spend $40 million on lawns annually. This is going through a variety of different sources, whether it be lawn care, lawn treatments, lawn companies, and all the equipment that comes with that. Part of that is 3 million tons of synthetic fertilizer, which we dump on lawns annually. That synthetic fertilizer then makes its way into our streams, which makes its way into our rivers, which kind of makes its way all along. Depending on where you are, it goes to various different sources. Kind of close to home for me, I tend to think about its effects eventually moving out to the Boston Harbor and the kind of coast of New England. The picture here is showing you the Gulf of Mexico. What you're looking at there is what's called the Gulf Dead Zone. The Gulf Dead Zone grows every year to hit about 7,000 square miles. It's caused by massive amounts of runoff, not just because of lawns, gardens. Agriculture's got a lot to say about this kind of large-scale industrialized agriculture that we don't tend to talk as much about. Well, when I think of NOFA, I don't think of large-scale industrialized agriculture. I think of the other end of things. But this large scale is an issue that I'm not going to keep going on because that's a whole different topic. What we have here with this kind of dead zone, though, is you get these huge amounts of excess nutrients. They result in large amounts of algae blooms. That algae then coats the surface of the water and disrupts the light's ability to permeate that water. That light permeating the water is very important. Without it, oxygen cycling shuts down and everything dies. This is not a good thing by any means. We dump 60 million acre feet of water on lawns annually. I'm not great with numbers. 60 million acre feet to me doesn't really mean anything. So to put it into perspective, if we were to take every single person on this planet who's currently lacking clean drinking water, and we were to take a tenth of the amount of water that we use in America annually on lawns alone, we could give every one of those people 7 gallons of water every single day. And the vast majority of the water we're dumping on lawns is drinkable. If we could somehow magically move this water all across the planet, we could pretty much solve the world's clean drinking water problems just by watering our lawns 1/10 less. I think probably the biggest issue for me is what we put on our lawns in terms of pesticides. These are terrible things. Of the 30 most commonly used, 16 are carcinogenic, 21 cause reproductive effects, 15 are neurotoxins, 13 cause birth defects, 25 cause liver and kidney damage. The most common one is a product called 2,4-D. It does every single one of these wonderful things. It is the one that is used more often than any other product on lawns in America. The reason this really kind of hits me the hardest is that when I talk to people about lawns and I say, hey, I want you to kind of think about reducing your lawn, maybe removing it, coming up with something else, they tend to turn to me. Every now and then I get some really legitimate reasons to keep the lawn, but the vast majority of the time it's my kids play on it or my pets play on it. And that's a problem when this is what's on the lawn. Kids and pets are more commonly exposed to these things because kids, especially the young kids and pets, tend to come into contact with the lawn much more so. You know, when I walk across the lawn, I literally walk across the lawn. When my dog walks across the lawn, he's rolling in it, he's digging in it. And then that comes into the house, and then that becomes a part of all of our daily lives. These are not things that we want to really be coming into contact with on a regular basis. So I'm not the sort of person to give you the doom and gloom without a next step. What can we actually do about this? I'm going to push for killing your lawn. This is always going to be my first goal. I want to convince people that removing their lawn and replacing it with something else, we'll talk about what that else is in a moment, is really our best bet. In many cases, I think of lawns, I mean, we can talk about all the environmental issues, but on top of that, I look at lawns as in most cases a waste of space. It's a lack of imagination. We put lawns in because it's the thing we were taught to do. We've got this kind of cultural concept that every house is supposed to be fronted with this lawn. And it's a concept that I think we need to start to break down. And in some places, this is happening more effectively, especially if you start having out to the West Coast, parts of California, parts of kind of Nevada, areas where lawn maintenance is even more intense than it is in New England. And by far, in many cases, especially when we're talking about water, you know, kind of lawn shaming and this idea of replacing lawns is starting to catch on in certain circles. It's really not catching on much here yet. But we're starting to see kind of pieces of it coming to life. So I mentioned these gradients of ecology, and this is what we're going to kind of talk about. The perfect lawn, and what I mean by that is your classic kind of golf course, monoculture, nothing but Kentucky bluegrass, mowed very low, treated with all the awful things we just talked about. That sort of lawn is actively killing life. That's not just doing, you know, no good, it's doing quite a bit of harm. Kind of the next step up from that, it's not a big step, but it's definitely a step in the right direction, is kind of that traditional lawn treated well. We can do less damage that way. It'll never be good, but we can use less pesticides. We can use up less water. There are tricks we can use, not tricks. There's tools we can use to just have a lawn that's the way it is. We're not about to change it, but we can change our maintenance of it. And that can actually have some effects, not huge effects, but I'll take a step in the right direction any day. Moving along, we've got these low mow options and other non-native replacements. They can range really quite a bit depending on which one of those you choose, and we'll talk about a couple of them. Most of them are at least getting close to the do no harm sort of direction. There are some of them that have some minor ecological benefits, nothing huge, but again, I will take those minor ecological benefits over that perfect lawn, or again, over the traditional lawn treated well. You know, we're moving up in the world. Finally, we start talking about native alternatives, and then we eventually get into the idea of just destroying the lawn and doing something else completely different, which I'm kind of keeping in a different category. And the reason for that is that if you use your lawn, and we'll talk about what that might mean in a moment, then you can't just replace the lawn with a forest. Then you can't use your forest the way you might have used your lawn. So if you need to have some sort of a lawn, these native alternatives are really kind of your best bet. But they're not perfect. There's a lot of issues with them. If they were perfect, we'd all have them already. So I'm going to try and be realistic today and give you all the details that you need to be able to make your own decisions on your own landscape. So let's start with this traditional lawn idea. Let's talk about why this isn't working so well and what you might want to do if you're going to kind of go the route and saying, I'm really not ready to go into the native spectrum, but I can at least make some steps. The standard lawn grass is Kentucky bluegrass. There's a lot of different grasses that make their way into lawns. I tend to lump them all together, and that's because they tend to really be pretty easily lumped. They're all very similar. Kentucky bluegrass is the most common one. It's not from Kentucky. It's a Eurasian species. It does well in a different part of the world. Think about Great Britain, because that's where this grass is really that's the kind of center of its native range. What it gets there is quite a different environment than what it gets here. Lots more rain. New England is a pretty wet area compared to a lot of other parts of this country. I mean, compare New England to, say, northern, California. You can see that we've really got a lot of rain, yet we don't get nearly enough for what Kentucky bluegrass naturally requires. It requires a higher water level, a higher nutrient level than we tend to have in our parent soils. We tend to have we're a glacial area. We've got a lot of glacial till. Soils are thin. Nutrients don't hold very well. This is vast generalizations, obviously. But the fact is that Kentucky bluegrass simply doesn't do all that well around here. So in order for it to do well, we need to give it these extra things. We put in an irrigation system. We give it extra water. We fertilize it because it needs more nutrients than it's able to pick up on its own. What plants do, and this is a pretty decent general thing, is that the plant above is representative of the plant below. And what I mean by that is the bigger the top, whether that be the size of a tree, or in this case, the blade of grass, the larger the root system is. Plants tend to grow in balance. And if you go out and prune your tree tomorrow, it will naturally kind of prune off some of its own roots. And this happens again in the grass world. So we water it. We fertilize it, we dump all these pesticides and herbicides and everything else on it to keep it happy. God forbid the thing actually starts growing. We get in there and we mow it down to size. And what we've done by doing that is we've caused it to not be able to develop a good root system. And this means it needs additional care from us, because without a good root system, it cannot pick up the water or the nutrients it needs. We're stuck in this weird cycle. We give it what it needs, it finally starts growing, we cut it down to size, then we need to give it what it needs again. We also tend to talk about the weeds and the diseases and the pests of lawn as if they are the problem. This chart is not perfect, but it makes the point. Most of these weeds, diseases, and pests are not directly the problem. They're a sign of an underlying issue. Dandelions aren't the problem. Dandelions are a sign of soil compaction and a low pH. So if you wanted a healthier lawn, you might go out and, uncompact your soil, maybe aerate, add compost. We'll talk about that in a moment. You'd bring up the pH and your lawn would be happier, but that's not how people tend to deal with these things. When we see dandelions, we go to the store and we buy ourselves some weed and feed, and we dump an herbicide on the lawn to kill off all the dandelions. The dandelions might die temporarily, but we've done nothing to address the soil compaction or the pH. If we wanted to actually solve the problem, we would say address the soil compaction and the pH. But addressing pH, if you want to do it in a permanent manner, requires changing your bedrock and waiting about 30,000 years. It's not realistic. We can throw down lime, and lime will raise the pH, but that soil pH is based on things that took a long time to develop, pretty much your bedrock and a whole lot of time. So the lime may raise the pH, but it's going to drop again. Our natural pH is going to be lower than what most lawns want to be. So we're constantly fighting this battle. And frankly, half the time we're not even fighting the battle. We're just dumping down an herbicide to kill off the dandelion and not addressing the underlying issue. So things we can do. We can change our mowing height. If you want to keep your lawn, mow as high as you are comfortable. The higher, the better. I would say 3 inches minimum, 3.5 would be better. If you can do 4, that's really starting to get a little more effective. What's going to happen when you do that is you're going to allow that grass to actually develop a better root system. And by developing a better root system, it's going to better be able to pick up the water and the nutrients it needs. And that would mean that we could then cut off our excessive fertilization and watering. That makes a huge difference right there. I'm not going to spend the rest of today telling you to keep your lawn and to simply mow it higher, but it's a step in the right direction. And for many people who aren't going to yet be ready to go the kind of full spectrum that we're going to get into, this is at least an easy first step that anybody can do. Aerate if needed. Frankly, I don't tend to aerate because I don't think it's worth the trouble, but you can kind of do a lot of aeration by simply top dressing with compost. If your soils are solidly compacted, the compost won't be enough. By kicking up the biological activity within your soil, which can be done by putting in compost, you tend to get a natural aeration of your soil, and this can definitely make a big difference. Again, I'm not going to make the argument you should keep your traditional lawn and just do these things, but again, simple steps, first steps, and maybe further down the line, we can move on from there. The final piece is embrace the weeds. We have this odd concept. I think a lot of you have heard this before. A weed is a plant out of place. Weed doesn't actually mean anything. It's a judgment call. We call a plant a weed because we don't want it where it is. I'll make the argument that Kentucky bluegrass is the weed and all the other plants growing next to it are probably the better options, but that's a different argument. What I want to say here is that we've been convinced that the lawn should be this pure monoculture of Kentucky bluegrass or whatever other turf grass. And that's not at all true. It doesn't need to be true. Most of these weeds in the lawn are actually quite beneficial. Whether they be beneficial for improving the soil or beneficial for an ecological reason or beneficial because they happen to look nice. Frankly, why we think it's terrible to have our green lawn spotted with white and purple and yellow flowers is beyond me. I will happily take the weeds. And in many cases, for people, the idea of a lawn, what they want is a low green thing. And that's really as specific as they get. And there's no need to remove these weeds in order to have a low green thing. You just leave them in place and mow it every now and then, and you've got your low green thing, and you happen to have some weeds in there as well. And at that point, they're not weeds anymore because they're doing you more good than harm. So let's talk about some of my favorite lawn weeds. We're moving up on that, ecological gradient. We're going to the point where we're not going to kill our lawn, but we're going to start allowing some other stuff to grow in there. Maybe we're even going to plant some other stuff in there and allow a diversification of the soil. Violets are a fantastic choice. Part of the reason they're a fantastic choice is most of the time you don't have to do anything and they tend to show up on their own. Most of the violets are native. The one we're looking at here, I don't know exactly what this is, but it's probably the English violet, which is not native. That being said, again, I will take that English violet over a monoculture of Kentucky bluegrass any day of the week. It's still at least a step in the right direction. And frankly, anyone who wants to tell me that this is ugly and this scene would be so much better if it was just lawn, really, we need to readdress what we're saying when we talk about that. I don't think too many people are actually saying that. It's just kind of been ingrained into us that these are weeds and therefore must be removed. How awful would it be if the violets took over the lawn and your entire lawn bloomed in the spring? Is that a bad thing? I'm trying to figure out why that's a bad thing. So two species that I really want to call out, Viola sagittata, the guy on the left there, that's the sand violet. If you have a lawn that is thin, the soils are sandy, things don't grow all that thickly, this is a great violet for you. It naturally grows in sandy soils. It's quite a common plant on the landscape. You find it growing anywhere from the coastal region well into inland, kind of America. It's a wonderful species. Blooms heavily in spring, some sporadic reblooms throughout the season, and if it's not sandy enough, it'll do just fine. Really, all it needs is sun. Most of what we're going to talk about today will do sun, but we will talk about some shade stuff too. On the other side, we've got Viola ceroria, the woolly blue violet. Don't get confused by the trilobe leaf in the center of the picture there. The violet leaf is that one towards the bottom, slightly on the right, that's got that heart shape to it. The Viola ceroria is probably the most common violet in our area. Violets are a real pain in the butt to identify. If you're walking around and you want to seem impressive and you see a purple looking violet and you point at it and say woolly blue violet, you'll probably be right at least half the time. And this one will grow absolutely anywhere. As long as it's got some, I'm trying to say what it needs. It really will grow anywhere. It won't do full shade. But as long as it's got decent light, it'll grow in dry, it'll grow in moist, it'll grow anywhere in between. And these are fantastic plants to have on the landscape. They're also important plants from an ecological point of view, and I'll get a little more into that a little further along. Houstonia caerulea, bluets, one of my absolute favorite plants. These are just diminutive little native plants, early bloomers, important sources of early season pollen and nectar for some of our smaller bees, mostly the mining bees and some of the pollinating flies. But these are wonderful additions to really any place, lawn or not. If anyone's ever been to, or if anyone's never been to Mount Cuba down in Delaware, this is one of their pictures. This is their moss lawn. And I challenge anyone to tell me that these are weeds in the lawn and need to be removed. I mean, their lawn is moss, and they've got a whole bunch of these bluets growing. The bluets do very well in the moist soils. That being said, in time, and they'll take their sweet time to do it, but in time, they will establish in dry soils and will persist just fine. These are wonderful little plants. Okay, before we get into the natives, I want to talk about some non-native options that are out there right now. There are some reasons why people might choose to go the non-native option over the native option. And really what that comes down to is price and the amount of time it takes to establish a new lawn. And those are things where the native spectrum hasn't quite caught up yet. We've got some more work to do to get our native plants into the realm where they can be as easy to address and as easy to accept and as cheap as a traditional lawn. We'll get there, but it's going to take us a little bit of time. So the eco lawns, and I use this as a plural, there's a lot of them out there these days. These are mostly, they're a mix of different grasses, mostly based in cool season fescues. And what cool season means when you talk about grasses is if you hear cool season, it means it grows in the cool season. If you have warm season, it grows in the warm season. And what that means from the fescue point of view is all that growth is in the spring and in the fall. So think about a traditional lawn. When are we doing all our mowing work? Pretty much happening in the summer, right? Especially if you get some good rain and you get some warm weather, that's when that plant is putting on all of its growth. That's when we're constantly mowing. And mowing is not a good thing from an ecological point of view. There's arguments for, cutting off the heads of dandelions and all the kind of, critters that get caught up. But from a carbon point of view, from an emissions point of view, two-stroke engines, small engines are not regulated to the same extent as cars by any means. Running a mower for an hour is about the same as driving a car for about 100 hours. It's much more damaging from an emission point of view. So the less mowing we can do, the better. And if you're going to be mowing, moving into that electric world and getting these electric mowers, especially if your electricity is coming from renewable sources, is at least a step in the right direction. But for most of us, we're still mowing with these old two-stroke engines, and that's a lot of emissions. So the advantage to these cool season fescues is all that growth is in spring and fall during the slow season. And by slow, I mean slow growth. There's a lot less growth that goes on. The amount of mowing that's needed is significantly less. Some people mow 3-4 times a year. You really only need to mow once or twice a year. And you can keep this lawn that still looks like a lawn and can be installed by going to the store, buying some seed and throwing it down, which is not something you can do with the native plants. We'll talk about that in a moment. These fescues are well adapted to thin soils. You do not need to water or fertilize them, at least after they're established. You definitely need to, you don't need to fertilize ever, but you will need to water them for establishment. There's some specific rules to follow, and whether you're going for eco lawn, eco grass, or these various other options, they'll come with a little instruction sheet about how to install it, how to establish it. You want to follow the instructions. And they'll get them established. It'll take some extra water. It'll probably require you to mow it a little more often. You'll help get them established. And then you get to this point where you don't have to water again. You're never going to fertilize. You only have to mow it once or twice a year. And all of a sudden you're at a point where your lawn is not going to be ecologically beneficial, but it's not going to be harmful anymore, at least significantly less. And from here, you can start kicking up that ecological beneficial value by throwing in some of those previous plants, like the violets, like the houstonia, and like some of the species we're about to talk about. The other option is white clover. A lot of people like clover lawns. This seems to be a growing thing. White clover, Trifolium repens, another non-native